So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. I just want to provide a couple housekeeping notes. We ask that everyone please keep themselves on mute for today's session. Just to note that today's session will also be recorded and the recording will be circulated and shared tomorrow. If you have any questions, we ask that you please put them in the chat box or unmute yourself during a question period. Thank you so much. I will pass it over to Tina.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for attending this month's VERB seminar, or the SIG on seminar for economics of risky behaviors. So like it was mentioned, so everybody is muted, but if you have questions that you want to or comments something that you want to address, it would be good if you put that in the comment, and you can put that directly to Davide. He's going to be handling the questions, and he will maybe ask Heather to answer or invite you to post your question at what appear to be appropriate time. So if you could just, he will keep an eye on the raised hands and the chat box, and you can of course put it, to everybody or directly to Davide. It's maybe easiest if you put it directly to Davide. And so with that, yes, and remind you, of course, which you saw, that it's being recorded, this session, so you know that. But with that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Heather Royer. She's a professor at UCSB and a research associate at NBR. She has a long list of publications related to health economics. Many of her publications related to the relationship between health and maybe education, a lot on birth outcomes and fertility related issues. And then she has also done quite a bit of work related to behavioral economics and incentives, and how incentives influence health behaviors. And that's what she's going to focus on in her talk today. And the talk is titled Motivation in Motion, Unraveling the Impact of Wellness Incentives. So with that, I give the floor over to you, Heather.
Thanks, Tina, for the nice introduction. So I'm going to talk today about sort of a body of work that I've been participating in for quite a while. Let me share my screen because I can't do two things at one time. And now, so this work is there. Hopefully you can see the screen. Okay. Yeah. So I'm not going to present any new work today, but I'm going to give you a sense of what I think of the state of the literature, at least through the eyes of my own research, about the effects of wellness incentives. And along the way, I'm going to try to emphasize some things that I think might be helpful for people who are thinking about doing RCTs, and the thoughts that we had when we were doing this type of work, like how do you measure certain outcomes, what things should you be aware of when you do RCTs. And so hopefully it will also be telling you about the research, but give you some sense about what happens behind the scenes. This work would be nothing without my co-authors, who I will gratefully acknowledge along the way. So long ago, not long ago, but long ago for many of you, maybe, I don't know, 2011, around 2009 or 2008, I got interested in this topic of the effects of incentives on exercise behavior. And at the time, I saw patterns like this. So this is from 2011 to today, where we see obesity rates rising rapidly. You can look at this across different countries across the world, and you see similar patterns. And so I think a natural question comes, as economists and people who think about policy intervention, is what can we do? And at the same time that obesity rates have risen, we've seen this high rate of physical inactivity in the US. So this hasn't increased at the same rate that obesity has, but it's a relatively high rate. So 25% of people in the United States are what we call physically inactive. So they don't
Heather.
participate in any leisure physical activity.
Heather, we still see your first slide, actually.
Okay. Let me, thank you for interrupting. Let me see, maybe if I share my whole desktop. And then,
Yes, better.
is that good?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for interrupting. Sorry about that. So we see this rate of obesity rising quite rapidly, and we could go back in time and we'd see that this is just a continuation of a previous trend. At the same time, we see high rates of physical inactivity. So rates in the US are about 25% of people we would deem as physically inactive. So the natural question, seeing these two sets of statistics, is what can be done? So one thing that I thought about back in 2008, and I was not alone, there were many people thinking about this, is can we encourage healthy behaviors? And as an economist, you think about changing the costs or the benefits of healthy behaviors. And so I was thinking about using incentives. So trying to increase the benefits of physical activity. So what I'm going to do in this talk today is I'm going to talk about what I've learned through my own work on exercise incentives and where might we go next in this area of work. So one of the reasons why I think exercise is a good place for policy intervention is that there's a significant gap between intentions and actions. So in a study I had recently that was published in 2022, we asked people who belonged to a private gym in Cleveland how often they intended to go and then we measured how often they went. So they had 7.2 visits over a 4-week period. How many times do you think they intended to go? So just to get people to be active participants in this presentation, why don't you can put something in the chat. So I will tell you that there's as the slide says, a significant gap between intentions and actions. The answer was they intended to go 11.5 visits. So there's about a 50% reduction relative to this intention and the actual number of visits they intended to go. Another reason we might want to intervene is the externality of health improvements. So often the use of incentives is said to lead to improvements in exercise, increases in exercise, which might improve productivity, especially in the workplace. And so a firm might be interested in implementing a wellness program to increase exercise because of these increases in productivity. Another way in which firms or the government might be interested in increasing exercise is because of reductions in healthcare costs. So in the US, firms provide health insurance. And so if their population is healthier, then the cost of premiums will fall. And so from the firm's perspective, they would like that because they subsidize health insurance. And then from the government's perspective, if increases in exercise lead to lower healthcare costs, this will improve federal budgets. And take this for what it's worth, but there is some evidence in the literature saying that physical inactivity accounts for 8.8% of US healthcare expenditures. So it does seem, at least on a correlational sense, that if we get people to exercise, there might be a large return in terms of healthcare expenditures. So the first set of studies that I worked on, we worked with a Fortune 500 company, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I ended up getting involved in this RCT, for those of people who are interested in RCTs, is that I was working in a department where a lot of people were doing RCTs, in particular thinking about educational interventions. And I was thinking, well, how do we increase or improve health behaviors, and thinking about the use of incentives for exercise. And I was chatting with someone who I was training for a marathon with, and he worked at this Fortune 500 company in Cleveland and introduced me to the wellness director there. And this is how we ended up running this study. So what we did was randomize people into 3 different groups at this firm. And you were either in the control, which was business as usual, the incentive group, which received incentives over a 4-week period, and then the incentives were removed after that 4-week period, and then an incentive plus commit group, where they were also offered the same incentives as the incentive group over this 4-week period. But after this 4-week period, they were offered the opportunity to create a commitment contract for exercise. And the way this commitment contract worked was you had to attend the gym at least once every 2 weeks over an 8-week period. So you can think about the length of that incentive program for the incentive plus commit group was 4 + 8 weeks, 12 weeks long, i.e. what we're going to call 3 months in this graph. And so what you can see here, when we plot the fraction of subjects with positive weekly visits, that the groups look similar before the intervention. These are the 3 periods of time here. At the time of the incentives, where both the blue group and the red group got incentives, we see elevated use of the gym. And afterwards, the incentive group falls. It's still elevated relative to the control, so there seems to be some lasting effect. But the incentive plus commit group continues to go at a higher rate than the incentive group. So it does seem as though this offer of a commitment contract augments the effects, the long run effects of the incentives. And approximately 12% of people took up this commitment contract. So what we conclude from this is that there's a positive response to incentives. There's a mild long run response. So if we look at the responses out here beyond the incentive period, we see that the treatment effects are about 1/5 the size of the in-treatment effects. This contrasts with some other work using college students, where the long run effects are higher. I'm not quite exactly sure why, and I don't think anyone's really tried to nail down why the treatment effects are, these long run treatment effects in the college population are higher than those amongst this set of workers. But that would be something I think some people could investigate in the future. And I think people should be cognizant of the fact that often studies are done amongst college students, and they just seem to be different than the population we may be interested in intervening with. And then these self-funded commitment contracts can increase these long-run effects. So this led us to another set of a couple of questions. One is that did this really increase overall exercise? So one challenge in the study, and I didn't mention the details, is the way we're measuring exercise is logging in to a gym, but this could lead to substitution of exercise from somewhere else. So what we did here was we asked participants how often they exercise to try to understand whether the effects we saw in the graph before were just a substitution of the place of exercise. And so in the top panel, we look at members. So these are people who belong to the gym. So not everyone belongs to the gym at this firm. It costs a small amount of money to be a member. And so I can't remember the exact fraction of people who belong to the gym, but there's a sizable fraction of the employee pool belongs to this gym. And so what you see is when you look at overall exercise in the survey data, it increases. We were worried that when you ask people self-reported, when you ask them about exercise and it's self-reported, that there's obviously measurement error. So you can compare our weekly visits to the gym based on survey data versus the actual measurement using the administrative data. And there does seem to be some difference. But if you just focus for the moment on this, you do see that, at least amongst self-reported data, that there's an increase in total exercise. And then if you look at non-members, you also see this increase in total exercise. And if you look at relative to these other estimates, it seems to be mostly an increase in overall exercise, that this increase in going to the gym is essentially almost 1-for-1 with an increase in overall exercise. So we interpret this as being that when you incentivize exercise at the gym, the corporate gym, it does lead to an overall increase in exercise. And that we shouldn't be so worried so much about substitution of other exercise outside the gym for exercise in the gym. So the question that always comes about when writing papers like this is, we don't care, a reviewer might say, we don't care about exercise, that you increased exercise. What we really care about is whether this affected health. So some people might say, oh, it's the change in exercise is too small. Individuals may cheat. In particular, they may sign in at the gym and then leave. So one thing just to be upfront about is that, and a challenge in this work is that to detect effects on health, especially things like weight loss, which people want you to study, at least referees do, you need really large samples. So our power calculations and for previous studies suggest a sample size of 10,000 participants, which is tractable for some researchers and difficult for others. I mean, to give you a sense of what it costs to run this first experiment, I think we spent over $100,000 in just incentives alone. So this is 10 times that size. So $1 million in incentives to detect effects on weight loss would be essentially the cost of running that experiment, just in incentives alone, not thinking about personnel costs. So in subsequent work, we've tried to focus on other measures of health that might be more malleable to increases in exercise. So, and that might be easier to measure in some sense. So what we did was, in one study, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, we added measures of blood pressure, and then we asked people to measure their pulse. The challenge there, though, is, for instance, like measuring blood pressure accurately is hard, even if you can teach people how to use a blood pressure cuff, because they can't cross their legs. You have to take into account whether they've had caffeine or not before doing the test. So it's sort of hard, but we thought that these might be more malleable to an increase in exercise than thinking about things like weight loss. And I think one thing also to think about is when you think about exercise, there's lots of health effects. And so trying to think about something that summarizes the potential health effects. So for instance, improvements in mood and mental health might also be something to think about too. So the second critique I mentioned is this cheating critique, that people might just show up at the gym and leave. And so in subsequent studies, in one study, we painstakingly added a checkout process where people had to check out of the gym. And what we found was cheating seemed to be minimal. We've also had people, research assistants, hang out at the gym to see whether people just checked in and then immediately left, and we didn't find that to be the case. So one of a set of questions that arose from this first study that we had was thinking more about the structure of incentives. So how long should incentives last and how should they be structured? So we investigated this further in this management science piece. So the design is similar to the first study I talked about. This is the same firm, same Fortune 500 company, of 20 fewer people in the study. And we had different incentives based on whether you're a member or non-member. So you're a member based on your pre-treatment membership. So if you remember when we initially recruited you for the study. So across members and non-members, we have constant and kickstart incentives. So the constant looks similar to what we had for the 4-week intervention, except now we're making it 8 weeks. And this is a $10 per visit for 8 weeks. The kickstart has the same max possible earnings, which is 160, but the way that the incentives are spread across the 8 weeks is different. So they're high initially, $25 per visit in the first 2 weeks, and then taper off to $5 per visit. Then for the non-members, and the idea being that a lot of behavioral economics suggests that maybe what we need to do is just push people over some threshold, and that will essentially induce habit formation. And then we had another treatment where what we call a constant short, which looks exactly like the constant, except for it's over 4 weeks instead of 8 weeks, to get a sense of whether the length of the incentive period matters for long run habit formation. And then we had what we consider kind of a novel intervention for members, which we called extended sporadic, which it was essentially a 16-week program, and over 8 random weeks, which you were notified the week before, you got an incentive. So you might be not chosen for the first week, and then the second week you're chosen and you get the incentive for that. Then for the 3rd week, maybe you're chosen again and you get the incentive, and so forth. But only 8 of the 16 weeks you would have incentives. And so the total maximum earnings is the same as the constant. In the program, it lasted 16 weeks. And then we have the control for the members and non-members. So I'm going to show you the patterns of use for members and non-members separately. So here is for the non-members, the patterns of use across the incentive period of time. So between 1 and 8 is the incentive, what we're going to call the main incentive period, where both constant and kickstart groups are getting incentives. The constant short is only lasting between 1 and 4. And what you see here is that the constant and kickstart both have the same increase in use at the beginning, although the kickstart has a $25 incentive in the first 2 weeks, and the constant has 10. And interestingly and surprising to us was that the constant short, even though the incentives are the same between the constant short and the constant in these first 4 weeks, they're much lower than that of the constant. So what are our takeaways from this? It seems as though we should think about incentives not only as the spot incentives, so the incentives that you have in that particular week, but the stream of incentives. We saw this interesting pattern that the constant people went more than the constant short, even though at those first 4 weeks they had the same incentives. And then it does seem as something I didn't point out that the long run effects don't seem to be very sensitive to what happened in the in-treatment period. So we see that the constant short, it has this elevated long run effect, but the patterns of use seem very similar with it to the constant and kickstart. So that I think that's one of the interesting things. So now let's look at the members. Okay, so recall again, we've got the constant and Kickstart, which you saw before, and then we have this extended sporadic, which lasts over the 16-week period, and you have over the eight of the 16 weeks you have incentives, and every person has different, they're randomized at the individual level. So what you see here is a little bit different than what you see for the non-members. In particular, for the Kickstart, their patterns of use just trail off rapidly after the first 2 weeks. Remember that they're getting $5 per visit in these first 2 weeks, and then $5 per visit. So it does seem as though they're responding to these lower incentives later on. However, the rate of use amongst the constant and the Kickstart seem to be very similar at the beginning. So there doesn't seem to be huge elasticity to the size of the incentives. And then if you look at the extended sporadic, it seems to increase, it seems to have very stable patterns across the incentive period, that the rate of use is relatively flat. There's a slight decline, but relative to the other incentive programs, it's relatively flat. And one of the ideas behind why we thought the incentive sporadic would work is that potentially it would leverage the fact that these incentives may lead to habit formation. So for instance, if you get incentives in 1 week, the next week you might go more than you would otherwise just because of the habit formation. So, and then the next week you might get incentives, and the pattern would keep going such that you're sort of leveraging some of the habit formation that you got from the weeks which you had incentives during the non-incentive weeks. So what we see is there's a small elasticity of response to initial incentives. We saw the constant and Kickstart have relatively the same. The sporadic incentives may improve beyond the constant incentives. One additional thing in addition to the habit formation effect that I just mentioned is the thing about sporadic incentives that I think is nice, and something that I think is emphasized by some literatures outside of economics, is that the novelty of incentives might matter. So if you have the constant incentive, the incentive program is the same week after week for 8 weeks, whereas the sporadic has a little bit of uncertainty and surprise, and that might make people more engaged with the program. And then one thing I think is important, and something I think is consistent across the work I've done in this area, is that the intensive margin effects may be different than the extensive margin effects. And so we consider this more in our paper. I'm not going to talk about it today. We have this paper in Management Science includes a model of habit formation featuring one-time startup costs, which might be important for members, and then threshold habit formation, which might be important for both non-members and members, and might attribute, and this model tries to distinguish why the effects might be different for members versus non-members.
Heather?
Yes.
May I interrupt for a question?
Yes.
So how do you control for the fact that eventually going to the gym also allows you to meet new people, new friends? So there may be contagion in a sense between different people. So there are, just that.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So one thing that we've done in these studies is if you incentivize a whole firm to go to the gym, at the same time, there's capacity constraints at the gym, and so that there might be crowd out. So one thing we've done is we've run these studies in cohorts. And so at any one point in time, there's few people from the firm that are incentivized to minimize these spillover effects. But it's something that we've been very conscious of because of SUTFA violations. that we're worried about in estimating treatment effects.
Thank you.
So one thing, so it seems from what I've presented so far, we've got some ideas that incentives work, but the big elephant in the room, and the one that I think a lot of people ask whether this is even an interesting research agenda, is that incentives are costly, and would they ever pass any cost-benefit analysis? So I'm going to take a step aside and talk about sort of the general rhetoric related to wellness programs, and then tie it back to talking about exercise incentives. So if we go back to 2009, there was lots of headlines in the US that looked like this about how Safeway, the grocery store, was this leading company in terms of its wellness program, that it had this huge return on investment to its wellness program. And as a result, interestingly enough, it affected policy. So the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, include what some people call the Safeway Amendment, which allows firms to change their premium based on wellness activities of their employees, so up to 30 to 40%. However, there was sharp pushback to this ROI of 4.26. And there are also headlines that you can find going back to the time of how Safeway was misleading this push towards wellness programs. So I think this is an example of why causal inference is very important, is how did Safeway get this 4.26 rate of return on investment? It looked at costs over time, but at the firm, lots of things were changing, and including they were changing the healthcare plans they were offering. And so they attributed this to their implementation of their new great wellness program, when in fact, it probably, this return on investment was overstated. So as a result, I think this led to a lot of great research on thinking about the effect of wellness program. And two studies I really, really like and admire, and they're incredibly impressive and extensive, are done by economists. So Song and Baker is an RCT of 32,000 employees at BJ Warehouse. And it's a clustered randomized trial where they have different firm locations are randomized to either treatment or control. And what they find is that there's increases in self-reported exercise and weight management, again, self-reported, but no improvements in healthcare spending or job performance. So it seemed like that their findings are not consistent with what Safeway purported that the return to wellness programs were. Similarly, this nice QJE paper where they ran an RCT at the University of Illinois, where they created a corporate wellness program, they found that health screening rates, this is what's called a health risk assessment in HRA, they increased, but no statistically significant effects on total medical expenditure, health behaviors, employee productivity, or self-reported health status. So both of these are big downers in terms of thinking about wellness programs, that wellness programs aren't really worth it. And I should say in this second study, they have a nice part of the study discussing why the industry was sort of misled to think wellness programs were useful, is just because of selection. So often firms would argue that these programs work, but they didn't realize, well, maybe they did realize, but they didn't account for the fact that the people selecting to be in these programs often were healthier. So how do we square these results with what I would say from my own work of being sizable social surplus to exercise incentives? So I think what we can learn from this work is that engaging employees in wellness programs is hard. So you see in the Jones, Molitor, and Reeve study, you see no effects on wellness activities. And in the Song and Baker's study, 30% of employees participated in these wellness modules. At the beginning, it was only 10% in the beginning of their study. So it's really hard to get people involved in these studies. And we also know that healthier employees select into the program. So if you're thinking about treatment effects on the treated, you might think that the people who are participating, the return to extra wellness activities is small. And so I think one thing to think about when we try to triangulate these two kind of separate but related literatures, is the health effects from participating in wellness activities may be different from the effects of the availability of a wellness program. And just, the standard conclusion of a lot of work in economics is that the average treatment effect is not equal to the intent to treat effect. And it's just really hard to get people to engage in wellness programs. And so if you offer a wellness program, it may not work because you don't get people engaged, not because the wellness activities don't improve healthcare costs. And so I think in terms of moving forward on making programs more effective, really trying to get employees engaged in these wellness activities might be fruitful. So now, as we move forward in this line of work, where do I think two areas might be ripe for more focus? One is thinking about program costs. So these programs are usually costly. As I mentioned earlier, that RCT of 10,000 participants just paying incentives might be something like $1 million. And one also problem or challenge with these incentive programs is often the people who receive the incentives are these inframarginal individuals who would have done the activity in the absence of the incentives. And also they may have there might be little return for them, the incentives. So one thing I think we should think about is whether we can harness insights from behavioral economics to reduce costs. So less costly incentive programs might be commitment contracts, which I discussed a little bit earlier, and I'm going to chat about next. Parimutuel betting, where people form a group and essentially buy into this group, and then if you're successful reaching a goal, then the proceeds of the group are dispersed amongst the members. There's also what I think this last kind of less costly incentive program is more from my own individual interest in wellness, which is things such as streaks. So if you're, I belong to a program called Paceline, which if you have 150 minutes of exercise each week and you repeatedly have it, then you create these week streaks, and you don't get anything for the weekly streaks except for the acknowledgement of a streak. And so I find it somewhat motivating. And so this is a very cheap kind of incentive. There's also work saying that leaderboards are helpful, where you might rank people according to how often they exercise or how close they are to their goals. Another area I think that might be interesting for future work is personalization of incentives. And it gets at some of the challenges I mentioned up here, which is that for many one-size-fits-all programs, you're paying a lot of incentives for inframarginal individuals. And so one thing you could imagine is having different incentives for different people and sorting people according to their demand for certain levels of exercise. This might increase engagement and might be helpful for targeting the most inactive of people where the returns might be the highest. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these two areas. So this one area for reducing program costs. So commitment contracts, I mentioned these earlier. For those who aren't familiar, just remind you of what they are. It's where you put your own money at stake to reach a goal. So an example is I put $100 at stake to go to the gym every week for the next 4 weeks. If I'm successful, I get this $100 back. If not, I lose. And so these, from the non-economist perspective, these contracts seem weird because at least in terms of a monetary reward, the expected value is negative. Because there's no positive return to this. The nice thing about commitment contracts is that there's only administrative costs of doing these, because the way I've described it here, it's self-funded. And these commitment contracts tie into existing theory. So often people motivate the use of these contracts by saying that the behavioral theory suggests that they'll be desirable to those who are sophisticates, i.e. those who know about their present bias. So for those of you who aren't familiar with present bias, it's for people who put stronger weight to payoffs that are closer to present time. However, in this paper recently that we have in Restud, we argue that this theoretical finding about the desirability of contracts for sophisticates is not robust. If you add noisy evaluations of the benefits and social pressure concerns, that theoretical finding falls apart. So I'm not going to talk about the whole study, but I'm going to talk about something that we found to be really interesting. So in this RCT, we ran amongst private gym members, so it's different than this Fortune 500 company, and we had almost 1,300 participants. And what we did was a lot of things, but one thing we asked people if they wanted to be in a standard commitment contract. So this is in column 1. So for this 8 visits, it would be a contract to go 8 or more visits over the next 4 weeks, or 12 or more visits over the next 4 weeks, 16 or more visits over the next 4 weeks. And what you see is what you'd expect is that the fraction choosing an 8-week visit commitment contract is 64%, 49%, 32%. So it falls as the threshold increases. We also asked people about commitments to go fewer. So we asked people, do you want a commitment to go less than 8 visits, 12 visits, 16? And you see non-trivial demand for these contracts. So our takeaway is that individuals are confused when we ask them about commitment contracts. And there's a lot of measurement error in the measurement of demand for commitment when we ask people whether you are interested in a commitment contract. So the conclusions in our paper says that threshold commitment contracts are not well targeted or welfare improving. Instead, piece rate incentives might be a better policy tool. So, but don't give up hope for self-funded incentives. What about what I would say partially funded piece rate incentives, where you pay a fixed cost for an incentive program? So for instance, you might pay $30 for a $5 per visit incentive program for over the 4 weeks. So you have sort of commitment plus incentive in such a program. So the second area I think is an interesting area of focus for future research is personalization. So as I mentioned, in my existing work and others, there's sizable heterogeneity in the response to incentives. members and non-members respond to incentives differently? And can incentives be more effective with personalization? So let's consider an example. So you offer a choice of a 10,000 step target versus a 3,000 step target for an individual. And your hope is that this will be this choice will be beneficial, or will help sort people according to their underlying step tendencies. So low step people will choose the 3,000 step target, and high step people will choose the 10,000 step target. But the problem is, if you offered sort of the same incentives for these two groups, that the 10,000 step target people would choose the 3,000 step target to get their incentive. So the key is to offer different incentives for these different groups to get the groups to separate, as I described. So this is the idea of a current working paper by Rebecca Dizon-Ross and Ariel Zucker, where they run a field experiment in India amongst diabetics, and they have step targets. So they have a bunch of different treatments, but just for simplicity, I'm going to describe a few of their treatments. So they have a choice group that's allowed to choose between having a low, medium, or high step target. And these are the rewards that they receive if they choose those. And then they have a fixed group across these three different margins, which get 20 rupees. So you can see these plotted here. So then they have this nice graph where they show average daily steps across average daily payments. So as they articulate in the paper, the preferences you want, you want high steps and low costs. So that's why the principal preference is this arrow's pointing downward. And what you see for the choice is you get high average daily steps, and the cost is not unreasonably high. And so their conclusion is that the offering choice outperforms. It gets people to choose into the groups that might be best for incentivizing themselves. So what have I learned? Incentives can induce behavioral change with some limited long-run impacts. The incentives affect the extensive margin decisions differently than the intensive margins decisions, and we should think about those carefully when we're thinking about sustaining exercise versus trying to get people to start exercising for the first time. Incentive novelty can be important. So in the study that we have in management science, we had that sporadic incentive where individuals didn't get incentives every week and had them randomly allocated across 8 of 16 weeks. And I think part of the success of that intervention was due to its novelty. Commitment contracts have been reported as being a win-win kind of incentive contract. In particular, they can be self-designed, so you can decide how strong you want your commitment. They're also self-funded, and so they're not very costly, but the work that we have recently suggests that they may not be welfare improving relative to piece rate incentives. And then lastly, I think allowing for choice in incentive design can induce advantageous selection. So as I just showed you in this India diabetic study, where you allow people to choose their step targets, it seemed to be a very successful type of intervention, and in particular in inducing the highest step count of the intervention of the different treatment arms. So where do I think we might go next? I think one thing that's interesting is that when we think about wellness, we're thinking about it much more broadly than we were 15 years ago when I started working in this space. So there's great papers on sleep, behavioral health, noise pollution. I'm just listing some of the subset of these wellness outcomes. And I think we'll tend to see more of these. And I think one thing that might be useful, or a new interesting area to look at, is sort of the interconnection of these. So if you incentivize sleep and incentivize exercise together or separately, how do the effects differ? I think also one thing that's useful is the use of theory to guide design of optimal incentives. So we have a lot of work in behavioral theory to help guide what might be useful in the presence of people with present bias problems. And so I think we could have more work using theory to guide what might be optimal incentives. As of now, we've only touched on a very small slice of the number of types of incentive contracts that one might have. And so I think maybe theory can help push us towards some more exciting incentive contracts that might improve behavior change. And then the third area, which I just mentioned, I think, is the targeting of incentives, trying to think about more of the personalization of incentives and how different incentives might work differently for different people. And so with that, that's all I have to say. And thanks for listening.
Excellent.
Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Heather. So I have a question here from Ima Zango. I don't know whether you want to ask it or I can do it otherwise.
Oh, I don't mind asking it.
Okay.
My question was, is there anyone, because you mentioned the leaderboards and things of that nature, and then you mentioned ROI. So I was just wondering, since you're in that world, if you know if anyone's doing any research that shows if personalized acknowledgement by the peer group affects ROI. So how traditional corporate companies will do awards and things of that nature, and have seemed to have similar effects. And so I said maybe that could be related to the leaderboards, that, but doing it in a way that a person prefers. So as you said, personalization. So maybe, as we've seen, not everyone wants to be like publicly acknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they like a note, or they'd like, a different kind of thing, a small group of their peers acknowledging them, something, personalized to them. So those are my thoughts.
So in terms of the leaderboard study, I remember long ago there was something at a gym where people were cycling, and I don't remember the details. It was a long time ago. It was probably like 15 years ago. Someone probably in the audience might be able to give the citation, but people were seeing, they were competing against who could cycle the most at the gym. I haven't seen more work in that area, but I have to admit that that this literature is so vast that I could be ignorant of studies that I should be more cognizant of. And I do think that one of the things, I think this came true when we're talking about the literature on nudges, is that for some people, nudges might be welfare improving and others might be welfare not improving. It might have negative welfare effects. And so I think this personalization might help in terms of bifurcating people, in terms of people choosing nudges or incentive structures where they might be welfare improving versus not, if that makes sense.
Are you saying they get the choice to know whether or not they, get the choice
so,
as how it's presented?
So I could imagine you offer an array of different incentive programs where you get the choice of being in a leaderboard or not, and not forcing people, because I do think that the work on nudges and it does suggest that some of these nudges can be welfare harming. And so we need to be cognizant of that. But for some people, it might be welfare improving. And so trying to get people to sort based on the potential welfare impacts of the incentives, although that requires them to kind of know ex ante those, and people might not know until they're engaged in those programs.
Okay, that makes
so-
sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we have three questions, one by Donna, one by Alejandro, and one by John. Then young man, if time allows. So Donna is asking whether she's curious about interactions with intrinsic incentives like desire to lose weight or improve health. Are these controlled for?
So I think this is a very good point to be made about the worries about using incentives in terms of, so some people argue that if you have an extrinsic motivator, such as an incentive, it might crowd out intrinsic motivation and in the long run be harmful. I think in terms of exercise behavior, that the documentation of such impacts is limited. The classic examples often come from education, where we pay kids for grades or things of that nature, and then later on, when we're not paying them, they do worse as a result. But my sense is that we don't see much crowd out of intrinsic motivation in the space of exercise.
Okay, then Alejandro, do you want to ask your question personally?
Yep. Hi, Heather. Thank you for your presentation. Just I wonder, you made a reference about the present bias, but couldn't it be that that there's a problem with the perceived rate of returns of exercising? It's like I am wondering, could it be like the same thing in the education field, which is the children have cope with the problem that their perceived rate of returns are the problem and not the rate of return. I wonder if you have something to say about this. Thank you.
This is one where I've thought a little bit about trying to document this imperfect sort of people's misperceptions of the return to exercise. So one thing we asked people in previous studies, and definitely people had misperceptions about how many calories would be burnt if you ran for 30 minutes. But we didn't do anything in terms of an intervention to try to change people's perceptions, but we do, but yeah, I could imagine that might be useful.
Then we have a question from John Coley.
Hey, Heather, how are
John?
you?
Hi, good. How about yourself?
Good. Thanks for doing this. I really, read and enjoyed and cited your various papers over the years. So it's really nice to see them all synthesized and hear your thoughts on where the field is going. So I actually have a personal question for you. So in case people don't know, like Heather's an endurance athlete. You've swum the English Channel, I think. And so how do you personally structure, like, do you create peer pressure by like creating teams to work out with? Have you ever used a commitment contract? How do you create incentives? How do you force yourself to practice as much as you need to? Like, how have you used this kind of information for your own practical purposes?
So for me, recently, I joined this Paceline group, which is a company which is trying to incentivize people to exercise in hopes of reducing life insurance costs. So they're trying to, they're getting life insurance companies to, they believe that there's a lot of money on the table that could be saved or profit from in terms of life insurance. And so this thing, it monitors me whether I've done like at least 150 minutes of exercise a week. And it seems to be very effective. And in fact, in the New York Times, I was interviewed for the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. And yes, I sometimes when I'm low on exercise, and at like 140 minutes, I do 10 minutes of exercise at like 10 p.m. I don't know why, but for some reason, even though I don't get really a return to the extra 10 minutes in terms of this Paceline app, something says that I need to keep my streak going. I also think just like having a dedicated time where you say that you're going to exercise and not let yourself procrastinate throughout the day on that is useful. So for me, it's like exercise classes or going to swimming practice or things of that nature that are helpful. Otherwise, then I'll just keep every hour, I'll just say, I'll do it next hour of the day. And then by the end of the day, I have no energy to do anything.
Yeah, well, no problem. So time is up. Probably there is time for a very quick answer to a question by Young May, who asks whether the incentives aim to change the individual's health beliefs.
Incentives change people's habits? Is that the question?
Health beliefs.
Health, say that again, sorry.
Health beliefs.
Health beliefs.
Yeah, sorry for my pronunciation.
Oh, no worries. We haven't, I mean, I guess, is this thinking about whether they change their beliefs on the returns to engaging in wellness? We haven't measured that, but it would be interesting and potentially could explain some long run effects.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
I think one thing that could be explored more is trying to understand why we see long run effects. Is it because people learn something new about the returns to exercise? They've now put exercise more into their routine day.
Or the utility of effort. It's not as costly as you thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Actually
exactly.
sleep well. Oh, yeah, same direction. Yeah. So I think we're running out of time. Thank you, Heather. It was excellent, very, very interesting presentation. This video is going to be, it's recorded, it's going to be online with your permission. And thanks to everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.
Thanks.